By 1849, California was dying, not from sickness, not from war, but from something far more sinister: genocide. Thousands of Native Americans who had thrived in California for thousands of years were being systematically hunted down, killed, enslaved, torn from their lands. And the man who became the gold rush's very first millionaire? He died penniless, his body left unclaimed in a vault for a year. The carpenter who first found the gold? He died broke and bitter in a tiny cabin. This is the part of the gold rush they don't teach you in school, the part nobody wants to talk about, but it's the part you need to hear.
I'm your host, Mr. Stark. Welcome back to Part 2 of the California Gold Rush series. If you haven't watched Part 1, go back and watch it now, because this episode builds directly on everything we just covered. And trust me, you're going to want the full context for what happened next. Let's dive in.
When James Marshall found that first nugget of gold, California was home to approximately 150,000 Native Americans. They had been living there successfully for over 10,000 years, different tribes, different languages, different cultures, but they were thriving. The Miwok, the Maidu, the Pomo, the Yokuts, the Kumeyaay, dozens of tribes with rich histories and sophisticated societies. When the gold rush began in 1849, everything changed. The 49ers came with guns. They came with diseases their bodies carried. They came with zero regard for the people already living there. To most of them, Native Americans were obstacles, inconveniences, things to be removed. What followed was one of the darkest chapters in American history, and it's barely remembered.
Miners murdered Native Americans indiscriminately. Some did it for sport. Some did it because they saw them as a threat to their claims. Some did it because they'd been convinced, by newspapers, by politicians, by their own racism, that Native Americans were less than human. There were bounty systems, real, official bounty systems. In the 1850s, the California legislature actually appropriated funds to pay bounties on Native American heads. Prices ranged from 25 cents for a scalp to $5 for a severed head. It was legal. It was governmental policy. Think about that for a moment. The state itself was paying people to kill Native Americans. Hundreds of miners organized into militias. They conducted what they called Indian hunts. They weren't hunts, they were massacres. They'd go into villages at dawn and slaughter men, women, and children. Entire communities were wiped out. The El Dorado County Indian War of 1849, the Mariposa War of 1850. These were supposed to be military conflicts, but they were really organized killings of civilian populations. By 1860, just 10 years after the gold rush began, the Native American population of California had dropped from 150,000 to approximately 30,000, over 80% killed. It was apocalyptic. Starvation played a role too. The miners destroyed the native food sources, the elk, the deer, the fish. They polluted the rivers. They burned the oak groves. They destroyed the acorns that were the foundation of native diets. The Native Americans were literally starving while surrounded by thousands of hungry fortune seekers. And some tribes, they were forced onto reservations, which functioned more like concentration camps. Miserable plots of worthless land where they were expected to farm, even though the government provided almost no resources. In 1863, hundreds of Native Californians were forced on a brutal death march to the Round Valley Reservation in what became known as the Nome Cult Trail. The conditions were horrific. Those who became too exhausted or sick to keep up were simply killed. This wasn't just the unfortunate cost of progress. This was systematic destruction. This was ethnic cleansing. This was America committing genocide against the people who had lived here first. Now, let's talk about what happened to the men who profited from the beginning of this catastrophe. James Marshall, the carpenter who found the first gold nugget. After his discovery, Marshall tried to maintain control of his operation, but it was impossible. Miners flooded the area. His claims were jumped. His authority was ignored. By 1850, he was broke. Marshall spent the rest of his life bitter and angry. He drank heavily. He blamed everyone around him. He lived in poverty in a cabin in the Sierra foothills. For a brief time, The state legislature granted him a $200 a month pension, but after intense criticism over his heavy drinking, it was slashed in half and eventually revoked entirely.
In 1885, James Marshall died penniless. He was 74 years old. He's buried in Coloma, California, the exact same place where he found the gold that changed America. But when he died, he had almost nothing. John Sutter, the man who owned the land and hired Marshall, had an even worse fate. Sutter tried to maintain his empire, but the miners didn't respect property rights. They didn't respect his claims. They didn't respect his authority. They came onto his land and took what they wanted. Sutter lost everything: his land, his cattle, his business, his reputation. By 1852, he was bankrupt, completely ruined.
He petitioned the federal government for compensation. He argued that the gold rush had destroyed his property and stolen his wealth. The government gave him a fraction of what he'd lost, but even that land became tied up in endless legal battles. Sutter spent his final years in Lidditz, Pennsylvania, living off a modest pension. He died in 1880 in a Washington, D.C. hotel room while still aggressively lobbying Congress for a payout. He had started as one of California's most powerful men. He ended as a forgotten nobody. Both men, the man who found the gold and the man who owned the land, died with almost nothing, while thousands of others got rich from their discovery. There's a bitter irony in that, don't you think?
But what about the people who actually came to California to search for gold? The 49ers themselves. Most of them had heard stories. They'd read newspaper accounts. They'd heard about miners striking it rich, finding nuggets the size of a man's fist, getting wealthy beyond their wildest dreams. The reality was brutal. For every man who found a substantial amount of gold, hundreds found nothing. They spent their entire savings to get to California. They traveled for 6 months overland or 5 months by ship. They arrived exhausted and broke.
Once in California, they had to purchase supplies: a pickaxe, a pan, food, shelter materials. These supplies were expensive. Merchants in the goldfields charged outrageous prices because they knew the new arrivals had nowhere else to go. Men would dig all day in freezing cold water. Their hands would freeze, their backs would ache, their lungs would fill with dust, and they'd find nothing, or maybe a few small flakes worth a few cents. Malaria was common in the mining camps. So was cholera, dysentery, pneumonia. If you got sick in 1849, you probably died. There were almost no doctors, no medicines, just suffering and death. Accidents were constant. Men were crushed by cave-ins, drowned in the rivers, killed in fights over claim boundaries. In the lawless mining camps, there was no law, no police, no justice system. Murder happened, and often the murderers just walked away. Crime was rampant. Theft was everywhere. If you struck it rich and word got out, you'd be robbed or killed for your gold. Men kept their gold hidden, buried in secret spots, swallowed it, hid it in their clothing. Depression was common. Men who'd left their families behind in the East were miserable and lonely. They spent their evenings in saloons, drinking to forget their mistakes. Many died from alcoholism and despair. Out of the hundreds of thousands of 49ers who came to California searching for gold, probably only 5 to 10% actually found significant amounts. The vast majority went home broke, or didn't go home at all. Some stayed in California and started farms. Others became merchants, selling supplies to miners. A few became wealthy from the gold rush, but not from finding gold. They got rich by providing services to the miners. The real winners weren't the miners. They were the businessmen, the speculators, the merchants, the politicians who took advantage of the chaos. And the real losers? The Native Americans, who lost their homes, their lands, their families, and their lives. But here's the thing. Despite all the suffering, despite the death, despite the genocide of Native Americans, the gold rush did create something. It created wealth. It created opportunity. It created California. The gold that miners pulled from the ground totaled over $2 billion in 1849 dollars. That's roughly $70 billion in today's money. An absolutely staggering amount of wealth. This wealth flowed through California and into the broader American economy. It funded infrastructure, it built railroads, it created cities. San Francisco went from a small settlement to a major port city in just a few years.
California became wealthy, powerful. Eventually, it became a state in 1850, not because of politics, but because of gold. The men who really profited were the merchants. Levi Strauss built a dry goods empire selling supplies to miners, eventually leading to his famous riveted work pants. Other merchants made millions selling pickaxes, shovels, food, whiskey, and supplies. The railroad barons made fortunes. The land speculators made fortunes. The politicians and businessmen made fortunes. But the individual miners, the men who risked everything, most of them lost everything. That's the California Gold Rush. A story of incredible wealth creation mixed with incredible human suffering. A story of American ambition at its most extreme. And a story of how one group's success came at another group's total destruction.
In part 3, we're going to zoom in on something I've only touched on: the stories of individual 49ers, the real people, the men who left everything behind to chase this dream. We're going to meet a businessman from Boston who abandoned his wife and 3 children to search for gold. We're going to hear about a formerly enslaved man who came to California looking for freedom and found something completely different. And we're going to follow a family who walked across the entire continent, lost 2 children on the way, and still kept searching. These are the untold stories, the personal stories, the stories that show you what the gold rush was really like for the ordinary people who lived through it. So subscribe right now, hit that bell icon, because part 3 is where things get really personal. While this series is built strictly on verified historical facts, some minor creative elements and dialogues have been dramatized to bring the flavor of the Wild West back to life. Drop a comment below and tell me, do you think the gold rush was worth the cost? Was the creation of California worth the destruction of Native American civilization? I genuinely want to hear what you think. And I will see you in part 3. This is Mr. Stark, signing off.